All right, so Roger Waters, the lead singer for Pink Floyd, who also does a lot of political activism at his shows and outside of his shows as well, recently sat down for an interview with this guy right here, CNN's Michael Smerconish, where it got pretty fucking heated on a number of different foreign policy issues that they talked about. They talked about Taiwan, they talked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so I just wanted to jump into this and watch through it and give you guys my take and respond to some of the back and forth that they were having throughout this. So let's go ahead and start this clip.
So here's the quote, as I understand, that begins the show.
If you're one of those, I love Pink Floyd, but I can't stand Roger's politics, people, you might do well to f*** off to the bar.
You might do well to F off to the bar right now. At the outset of the show?
Yeah.
Because
it's a really good way to start the show. But apart from anything else, it sets a few things straight.
Namely?
Also it encourages a lot of the people who have come to the show, because they have listened to everything I've written since, 1965 or whenever I started writing songs. So they do know what my politics are, and they do understand where my heart is. And they understand sort of why I'm there. But maybe it also gives a message to people who don't want to be there, in which case them effing off to the bar is probably not a bad idea. Except that you never know, those people, if they sit in a community like my audience is on these shows of This Is Not a Drill on this tour, there is such a great feeling of communication in that room between me and the audience, and between us combined with all our brothers and sisters all over the rest of the world, irrespective of who they are, where they live, their ethnicity, their religion, their nationality, or anything else. Because if This Is Not a Drill has a message, it is that we have to communicate one with the other.
To the guy.
Okay, so I mean, obviously that's just like the intro. They haven't really gotten heated on anything yet, but I think that that's kind of a dumb question to some extent, because number one, Pink Floyd and especially Roger Waters, he's always been political, and their message has always been somewhat political, especially from like an anti-establishment, left-wing critique level. So I mean, that shouldn't really be surprising to anybody who knows his music or anything like that. But on top of that, it shouldn't really be considered controversial at all for like artists or musicians to have some sort of a political messaging at their show. And from what I could tell from that intro there, pretty much all of it is based, standing up for Palestinian rights, standing up against the right-wing attacks on abortion rights here in the United States, etc. So far seems pretty like, a watered down, nothing really to get angry about, but let's see where they go from here.
Guy who says, shut the F up, play the hits. Do you want him, as long as he doesn't shout it out, do you want...
Also, it's kind of funny because this guy, Michael Smerconish, said that he was a big fan of Roger Waters and his music and Pink Floyd and all of that. So when he says, like, if you're not interested in my political messaging, to fuck off, he's kind of, in some ways, talking directly to Michael Smerconish. So maybe that's why he is pushing back against this.
Want him in the arena?
I don't not want him there, so long as he doesn't annoy the people who do understand what's going on in the arena. I'm happy for him to
But I'm saying, like, do I have to buy in? Does a person in the crowd have to buy in to the message? I've always loved the music.
Right.
Some of the messages I can buy into and some I can't.
I've only got one message. Two strangers passing in the street, by chance two passing glances meet, and I am you, and what I see is me. That is my message. And that was on Medal, which was in 1970. And basically, my message hasn't changed. I recognize your humanity, but I recognize all the Russians and the Chinese and the Ukrainians and the Yemenis and the Palestinians.
Are you an equal opportunity offender on this tour? Here's why I ask. I remember the last tour. Of course, I came and watched. Very much, about Trump. And in the current show, you've got a montage of war criminals, according to you, and a picture apparently of President Biden on the screen, and it says, just getting started. What's that all about?
What? What do you mean, what's that all about? I mean, it's right there on the screen. You had a clip of Donald Trump followed by a clip of Joe Biden, and then it just says war criminal who's just getting started. I mean, Joe Biden, okay, this is somebody who aggressively lobbied for the Iraq war, okay, completely unjustified, illegal invasion of a country that did not attack us, had nothing to do with 9/11 or any of the bullshit weapons of mass destruction justifications that they gave for the invasion. He was one of the biggest people pushing for that. I mean, that's a war that led to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties and deaths within Iraq. So yeah, I mean, just on that one point alone, Joe Biden could be considered a war criminal. You could also get much more specific and much more recent with, for example, as we were pulling out of Afghanistan, his drone strike in Kabul, where they initially came out and said, oh, we got him, we got that ISIS suicide bomber. Later we find out, no thanks to the Pentagon themselves, but thanks to an independent New York Times investigation, that they didn't actually kill an ISIS suicide bomber, but they did in fact kill, I think it was like 7 innocent children in that bomb. So I mean, just on that alone, that would be considered a war crime. So really, anybody who understands Joe Biden or Donald Trump's foreign policy agenda shouldn't even question for a single second that somebody might call them a war criminal. But let's go ahead and see what problem he has with this.
President Joe Biden?
Yeah.
Well, he's fueling the fire in the Ukraine for a start. That is a huge crime. Why won't the United States of America encourage Zelensky, the president, to negotiate, obviating the need for this horrendous war that's killing.
You're blaming.
We don't know how many Ukrainians.
But you're blaming the party
Russians
that got invaded. Come on, you've got it reversed.
Well, no,
I think that's kind of lazy. Listen, I mean, I know that there's going to be some heated discussion in this, regardless, when you're, discussing Ukraine or Russia and this ongoing invasion. But at the end of the day, you can say both things, right? You can both simultaneously recognize that Vladimir Putin, as an oligarch imperialist, was definitely the primary aggressor in this situation and doing a completely unjustified invasion of Ukraine. But you can also understand how the United States and the West more broadly, the UK, etc., have also been adding fuel to the fire, that their strategy in approaching this has not been one that puts Ukrainian lives first and foremost. It has been one that puts the interests of the military-industrial complex first and foremost. I mean, we've dumped, at this point, I don't even know how many tens of billions of dollars into this war. We've had reports coming out that like only roughly 30% of the weapons that we are giving to Ukraine are actually ending up at their final destination. Tons of them are being sold on the black market. There's lots of unaccountability in that equation as well. I mean, all of those would be fair things to point out. It's obviously fair to label of Russia and Vladimir Putin as the primary aggressor, while again simultaneously realizing the flaws of the U.S. State Department and our various allies in not having the best intentions for this war. But they continue here.
Well, that's any war. When did it start? What you need to do is look at the history, and you can say, well, it started on this day. You could say it started in 2008. Okay, this war is basically about the action and reaction of NATO pushing right up to the Russian border, which they promised they wouldn't do when Gorbachev negotiated the withdrawal of the USSR from the whole of Eastern Europe.
When you say this...
Okay, so that part of it is like kind of partially true. The United States did at least heavily imply, if not outright, kind of make an under-the-table deal that we were not going to expand NATO further into Eastern Europe. But still, at the end of the day, we know what Vladimir Putin has said about this war. And part of the initial justification that he was saying was that this was about NATO expanding further closer to Russian territory. But there's a number of different flaws with that. Number one, there wasn't really any likelihood that Ukraine was going to be admitted into NATO in the immediate future. But also we had the statements from Vladimir Putin himself describing how this wasn't just about NATO. This is about like him reliving or trying to revitalize like imperialist Russia and not even the USSR, but like pre-USSR imperial Russia, and pushing those types of ambition and basically saying that the entirety of the Ukrainian state doesn't have a right to exist in any way, shape, or form, and pushing a lot of like blood and soil arguments throughout his statements regarding this. So I don't think you could possibly say that this was just about NATO expansionism from Vladimir Putin's perspective. I think it's much larger in scope than that. But again, at the same time, there is somewhat of a fair point to be made there in terms of NATO violating or the United States violating previous implied or outright agreements that were made to not aggressively expand NATO. So, I mean, he's kind of right in that sense, but also kind of a little bit misleading in, portraying that as if that was like the main or sole justification that Putin was giving for the war.
Then I have to say, what about our role as liberators? You of all people...
You have no role as
What about our role as liberators? Are you fucking kidding me? I mean, again, this is CNN, this is Michael Smirkanish. I don't know what more I would be expecting from him, but goddamn, I mean, still pushing the idea that the United States is liberators. I mean, what example would you have as the United States as a, quote, liberator? I mean, you could obviously go back to World War II if you wanted to, but that's, decades now in the past. And as Noam Chomsky has previously said, which I think is 100% accurate, if every every single U.S. president post-World War II would have been hung at trial if the laws of the Nuremberg trials were put in place in a modern context. So, I mean, every single U.S. president throughout history, at least since World War II and even previous to World War II, has been a war criminal and has been engaging in unjustified wars of aggression on many different fronts. But again, the idea that we are like liberators, that our foreign policy agenda has anything whatsoever to do with spreading democracy or fostering peace, it's just complete and utter bullshit. I mean, again, you could talk about the Iraq invasion, the Afghanistan invasion, the Korean War. You could talk about the Vietnam War, so many different examples throughout recent and history in the United States where we've just engaged in rampant, unjustified wars, siding with dictators left and right, installing dictators ourselves, siding with fascist regimes. I mean, you see this right now with the Biden administration getting on his hands and knees and groveling to the dictator of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. So, I mean, the idea that we are liberators in any way, shape, or form in a modern context is just completely fucking ridiculous at every level. But he responds to this.
Liberators.
World War II? World War II? You got...
So I didn't even realize that, but he literally did just bring up World War II. I mean, listen, if you have to go all the way back to World War II to try to demonstrate that the United States foreign policy agenda is justified or is one of a liberating character, I mean, completely fucking embarrassing at that point. I mean, you could definitely make the argument that the United States joining the war reluctantly, mind you, after the Soviet Union did vast disproportionate amounts of work in that war fighting the Nazis and Japan as well. But we hopped into the war late, and yeah, you could definitely say it was justified to fight against the Nazis, to fight against Imperial Japan. That's 100% true. But even in that context, even during World War II, I mean, people just kind of gloss over the fact that, we nuked two gigantic cities in Japan. I mean, we are the only country throughout all of human history to use nuclear weapons in a war, okay? And we did that, and we evaporated hundreds of thousands of people from the face of the planet in an instant, okay? And on top of that, that doesn't even account for the death toll of the previous firebombing campaigns that came before the nukes that we dropped on Japan that killed even more civilians in those bombing raids as well. So like even in the role that we played in World War II, you could make the argument that it wasn't one of like, having the intentions of going in there as liberators. It was a war that we joined reluctantly only after Japan attacked us. And on top of that, once we did join the war, we did a tiny fraction of the work relative to the USSR. And on top of that, in the capacity that we were fighting this war, we were committing war crimes left and right. So even using that as the one justification or the one justified war that the U.S. has engaged in as liberators, I mean, sure, I'll grant that to you, but again, kind of embarrassing that you're having to go all the way back to World War II to bring up an example of justified U.S. foreign policy actions.
Into World War II because
Come
it's
on.
Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor. You were completely isolationist until that sad, that devastating,
I would argue
awful
we were
day
always going to get in, and that
1941.
pushed us in. But thank God the United States got in, right? You lost your father in World War II. Thank God the United States.
But
right?
thank God the Russians had already won the bloody war almost by then. And don't forget, 23 million Russians died protecting you and me from the Nazi menace.
I mean, that part is just like an objective fact. I mean, they lost, I think, the single most amount of any country that was engaging in that war. But, whether or not they would have been able to beat both Japan and the Nazis by themselves without any help from the United States, I don't know. I'm not like a military expert or a, World War II expert, so I don't know what the answer to that would be. But I think it's kind of a side point away from the main point here, which is that we're talking about fucking World War II in the context of discussing the United States' current foreign policy agenda, which is, again, completely ridiculous and embarrassing.
Hey, and you would think the Russians would have learned their lesson from war and wouldn't have invaded Ukraine.
Well, you,
Fair?
with all your reading, I would suggest you, Michael, that you go away and read a bit more and then try and figure out what the United States would do if the Chinese were putting nuclear-armed missiles into Mexico and Canada.
The Chinese are too busy encircling Taiwan as we speak.
I mean, he just kind of completely avoided the point that Roger was trying to make in that context. I mean, he kind of made it like a loose point, but the general concept there is fair. I mean, right, we're talking about the ongoing, potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or whatever the case may be. Nancy Pelosi going and doing her absolutely pointless and useless trip over to Taiwan to go meet with a lot of their corporations, semiconductor manufacturers, etc. But again, at the end of the day, I mean, if you're going to analyze this situation, and that was a fair question that Roger Waters was putting forward there, right? But if you're just going to analyze the situation by saying, well, China bad because, of their treatment towards Taiwan or their military posturing over the Taiwanese Strait, if that's your entire analysis when somebody is genuinely trying to ask you about, the U.S. role in extending our foreign policy, our military bases all around the world. I mean, you go look at a map of military bases that the United States has. We are literally encircling basically every single one of our, perceived political adversaries. So, the idea that the United States is simply like a backseat driver, or that we're like, simply a defensive, peaceful actor in any of these situations is completely fucking ridiculous. I mean, again, this would be a similar situation to like, China going over and fighting for the liberation of Puerto Rico and like posting up and sending their diplomats over to Puerto Rico or something to, push for the, separation from the United States or something like that. I mean, it's completely ridiculous to think that, multiple things can be true here. Let me make this clear, okay? China can have, imperial ambitions and trying to control Taiwan and, not allow them to exist in the status quo that they have been since the Civil War in China. You can have two things be true, that both China is being somewhat of an aggressor in posturing over Taiwan, but also it could be the case that the United States doesn't have any right or justification whatsoever to go around being the world police and pushing with our military in order to, prevent China from engaging in their little version of imperialism within Southeast Asia. I mean, what fucking right does the United States to have to go back into this region, a region where, again, we have a historical track record of supporting fascist far-right regimes, including Taiwan, directly after the Civil War with Kai-shek as their leader. So, I mean, so many different examples here where the United States has been on the wrong side of wars, specifically in Southeast Asia, but also around the world. So, again, the idea that, like, we should be the world's police or that we have the right to dictate a lot of these things, in my opinion, is just completely ridiculous. But Michael Smerconis just kind of glossed over that and just moved on to the next subject. But, completely ridiculous framing there.
Okay. They're not encircling Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. And that's been absolutely accepted by the whole of the international community since 1948. And if you don't know that, you're not reading enough. Go and read about it.
Okay. Did we solve anything here today?
Okay, I mean, again, he just didn't really respond to that statement at all. I mean, listen, we have a one China policy that we have been adhering to, that China has been adhering to since the Civil War basically broke out in China and the communist forces won that war. But again, even the United States, I mean, just when Nancy Pelosi was going and doing this trip recently, the official State Department representatives were coming out and saying, we do not support Taiwanese independence. That is the official, openly stated position of the United States and basically of the entire global community. So, the idea that you're just going to gloss over that question, you're not even going to address that reality is, again, pretty ridiculous there.
We did. Well, I mean, no, we didn't.
I mean,
you're believing your propaganda, your side's propaganda.
You're defining it as
Taiwan,
propaganda.
you can't have a conversation about human rights, and you can't have a conversation about Taiwan without actually doing the reading.
Roger, if you're having a conversation about human rights, at the top of the list of offenders are the Chinese. Why is it always the Western world?
At the top of your list.
Why is it always the
Chinese
Western world?
didn't invade Iraq and kill 1 million people in 2003. In fact, as far as I can recall, hang on a minute, who have the Chinese invaded and murdered, slaughtered?
Their own.
Bollocks.
Okay.
That's absolute nonsense. Complete nonsense. You should go away and read, but read some proper
Hey, my
literature.
problem is I spend too much time reading your liner notes, okay?
All right, so I'll go ahead and finish it off there. I mean, on that last point that they were just going back and forth on there, sure, there are definitely things that you could criticize the government of China in terms of like human rights abuses, especially with like Uyghur Muslim populations within China. There's definitely things that are fair critiques there in terms of human rights abuses, but at the same time, Roger is 100% correct to say, who the fuck is the United States to be posturing, to do moral posturing on any country on the face of the planet? I mean, you want to talk about foreign policy over the last 50 years or since World War II, the United States has been, alongside the USSR for a period there, obviously, but has been basically the global hegemonic power. Okay, we have been the vast military power that has been dictating a lot of the world's foreign policy and domestic policy with our interventions, invasions, etc. So the idea that like the United States has the ability to morally posture over anybody for human rights abuses, I mean, we're aiding and abetting an ongoing apartheid and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people with our arms sales. We're still selling arms to Saudi Arabia, a dictatorial, theocratic regime that is committing a genocide in Yemen. We still have, obviously, again, as he pointed out there, the Iraq invasion, the Afghanistan invasion, the Vietnam War, the Korean War as well. So many different examples that you could point out here where the United States is just absolutely nobody to call out human rights abuses by any other country on the planet, which, listen, if you are an average person, right, I can sit here and have valid critiques of China, the government of China or the government of Russia or Saudi Arabia or any number of other human rights abusers, and it's perfectly fine to point out those critiques. But if you're going to posture and pretend as if like the United States government has the ability to do those things, it's just completely ridiculous. I mean, it's a perfect example of like clean up your own fucking house before you start trying to go around and fix the world with your military. I mean, it's a perfect example of how the United States just deems everything that we do to be inherently good because we are the big bold freedom fighters. We are the liberators, as Michael Smerconish was just putting it there, for the entire world, when it's just complete and utter bullshit. I mean, again, if you know anything about the history of the United States and our foreign policy agenda, it has been one of toppling democracies, installing fascist regimes, crushing leftist opposition forces whenever they feel that it's necessary, whenever U.S. capitalists can't exploit the resources or the labor pools of various countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. Again, I mean, such a horrific track record to turn around and just pretend as if we are the liberating forces, to turn around and portray the United States as some sort of a good force in the world right now is completely ridiculous. But again, I mean, they got into a bunch of different nuanced things that you could talk about all day. The degree to which we have been funding and arming Ukraine, I think there's a lot of good debate there to be had. I mean, again, we don't know where a lot of these weapons are going. We don't know whose hands they're falling up in they're ending up falling in. We don't know a lot about the actual details of the on-the-ground situation in Ukraine. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of good debate to be had there. There's also a lot of good debate to be had around the issue of Taiwan. I definitely think it's fair to point out the imperial aggressions of both China and Russia, but also you have to recognize that the United States, when they push a narrative like this, when somebody like Michael Smerconish is pushing a narrative like this, they just completely sweep it under the rug. They accept it as a fundamental premise that the United States is always inherently the good guy, and so when we go over to Taiwan or when we go into Ukraine as well, that we must be there with not only happening to be on the right side of history, but going in there with good intentions, which is just absolutely not the case in either of those situations. So, I mean, I think they both kind of made some interesting points there. I think Roger Waters kind of went a little bit farther than I would in terms of, critiquing some of those things. But all in all, that was pretty entertaining. CNN doesn't really do interviews like this, so I hope that they end up bringing on more like controversial figures in the future, because he was saying a lot of things there. He was spitting some fire that CNN audiences are not usually exposed to.